World War I allowed for many countries to thrive and grow, but also pushed countries to the ground and deeply affected them. Nationalism allowed for countries to believe in themselves, yet many rumors of other countries came about. The weapons used were vastly improved over the course of the war and allowed for many casualties overall. The death toll at the end of the war was extremely high and caused many different things that no one could have ever imagined. While the war had high and low points, countries as a whole struggled to establish themselves. As the war progressed, people began asking themselves if the war would ever end.
Nationalism is defined as an extreme form of patriotism and loyalty to one's country. Citizens place the interest of their own country above the interest of other countries. Prior to the war, Europeans believed that their culture, economics, and military were superior to those of other nations. The concept grew as a result of the recent Enlightenment, making people think of freedom, equality, democracy, and containment and limitations. They were overconfident and, as a result, created rumors about rival nations. Royals, politicians, and diplomats did little to deflate nationalism. Some even actively contributed. Rumors varied from the country being deceitful or uncivilized, and others believed their nation was being threatened. Nationalists believed that if war broke out, they would be victorious. Imperialism, militarism, and nationalism worked together to create an illusion of the need for war. Forms of aggressive nationalism often caused tension. Nationalism was especially intense between Germany, Austria-Hungary, Britain, Russia, Italy, and France. To be the greatest of all nations, you would have to be the best at everything, military and economy.
Germans had a young, militaristic nation and were obsessed with imperial expansion. They had extreme faith in their Prussian military and expanding their battleships. Germans believed that British was their main obstacle for their expansion. Britain oversaw the world's largest empire, where they had 2 centuries of imperial, commercial, and naval dominance. One song they sung was Rule Britannia, which stated that the British will never become slaves. They were a popular target in the pre-war German press, and Britain was painted as being selfish and greedy. Russia's czars believed that the throne and empire was protected by God and their 1.5 million men army. They believed that their population gave them the upper hand. France believed that they had a wall of concrete fortress and defenses along the eastern border to withstand German attacks. In some aspects, it could be considered by a unifying factor, but on the flip side, it created large amounts of rivalry between nations. In the beginning of World War I, the Slavic groups in Austria-Hungary wanted their own nation. This was called post-Slavism and were directly led by the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, leading to the outbreak of World War I. From there, the nationalist spirits were fueled by newspapers, press reports, literature, music, and theater. This propaganda gave citizens an almost false standard that when war erupted, their country would emerge as victor. Their country was also portrayed as the righteous one and the one that needed defending, causing many people to join the war effort.
In general, war usually creates innovations and new inventions. World War I clashed 19th century and 20th century ideas and technologies together to move the war along. Weapons were deadlier than anything known before. The power of defensive weapons made winning the war on the Western Front impossible for both sides. To get out of the trenches, soldiers would cut through barbed wire before and use rifles, bayonets, pistols, and hand grenades to capture enemy positions. A victory during the war usually only meant a few hundred yards of torn-up land from the shells, along with many dead. Attacks, snipers, artillery, and poison gas caused misery and death. Wounded men would lie helplessly in the open until they died. If they were rescued, there were horrible sanitary conditions before being taken to medical facilities. Airplanes, balloons, and airships were used to observe many enemy troops and drop bombs. Enemies would also try to shoot planes down. Airplanes that fought in the air were called dogfights, and pistols, rifles, and machine guns were used. Pilots didn't have any parachutes and usually didn't live long.
Originally, planes were simple and did their job, but both the Axis and Allies were in a race to see who could design the better fighter plane that could fly, hold bombs and machine guns, and be easy to maneuver. Soon, dogfights occurred in the sky, and air superiority became more significant. Chemical warfare and poison were first used by the Germans in a surprise attack on Flanders, Belgium in 1915. The poison was released by the cylinders and carried by the wind to nearby enemy lines. Later, they were loaded into artillery shells that went into the trenches. This caused mass amounts of suffering and death from the burning in the lungs that caused their lungs to liquefize. Many found that it relieved pain to urinate on a cloth and put it to their nose and mouth. At first, the gas was ineffective and largely depended on weather conditions. They became more of a psychological weapon that struck fear into the masses. Gas masks were provided to soldiers later in the war for relief. Prior to World War I, the Gatling gun was the most rapid-fire weapon. The British created the Vickers gun with the intention of becoming mobile. Soon, the U.S. invented the Lewis gun, which was lighter but less reliable than the British model. In general, a great amount of war casualties were caused by heavy artillery. Since machine guns were portable and powerful, they were very useful. Machine guns were used in airplanes and on the ground. In July 1916, Germany used the machine guns at the Battle of Somme in Britain and killed and wounded 60,000 men in just one day. It was originally created by the American Hiram Maxim, but the Germans stole the concept because they saw the military potential.
U-boats were designed by the Germans to be dangerous and effective. In September of 1914, the Germans sank 3 British cruisers in just 1 hour. U-boats turned the public's opinion against Germany even more than before. On February 1, 1917, Germany ordered a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, but it ended on just February 3, 1917. Tanks, nicknamed the Armored Landships, began development in 1915. They were first used in the Somme Offensive in 1916. The British Mark I was the very first tank in action and was first used September 16, 1916 in the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. While it first killed its occupants more often than its enemies, people saw the large potential and established the tank's corps in July 1918. Also, though previous models existed, the first modern flamethrowers were invented for World War I. In 1901, Richard Fiedler gave the design to the German army and tested it through 1911. During the utilization of trench warfare, their true potential was realized. Unlike destructive grenades, flamethrowers would burn alive enemy soldiers in the confined trenches.
In 1915, the British invented tracer bullets, but they were erratic and had extremely limited uses. They were designed to emit small amounts of flammable material and leave a trail behind to detect the bullet. In 1916, a second model debuted that emitted a green-white trail and ended up being very successful. The flammable material made it extremely easy to ignite the hydrogen-filled German balloons. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army installed the very first two-way radios in planes so you could communicate while still in the air. The idea began in 1915, and by 1916, radio messages could be sent up to 140 miles away and exchange messages between planes in flight. Soon in 1917, a human's voice could talk to operators on the ground. Since there were so many weapon advancements, it also led to many medical advances. Celluloid cotton, a byproduct of processed sugarcane, was developed to use as field bandages since they were more absorbent and plentiful than surgical cotton. Also, Marie Curie installed mobile medical machines to treat soldiers with minor to life-threatening injuries. All these weapon advances led to many more deaths.
No one predicted the consequences of modern weaponry that was used with out-of-date tactics. This caused many deaths on both sides. Countries lay in ruins, and the consequences of such advances in weaponry left around 38 million military and civilian deaths. On the Allied side, Russia had 9.15 million casualties, France had 6.1 million casualties, Great Britain had 3.1 million casualties, Italy had 2.1 million casualties, Japan had 1,210 casualties, Romania had 535,000 casualties, Serbia had 331,000 casualties, Belgium had 93,000 casualties, Greece had 27,000 casualties, and Portugal had 33,000 casualties. The Central Powers also suffered the loss of many casualties. Germany had 7.1 million casualties, Turkey had 995,000 casualties, and Bulgaria had 266,000 casualties. About 8.5 million died due to wounds and/or disease. The greatest number of casualties were from artillery, small arms, and poison gas.
No agencies were established to keep records of fatalities, so as a result, we will never know exactly how many people died. Being on the front line trenches was extremely dangerous. Every day, enemy artillery shells would fall into the trenches. About 1/3 of all casualties on the Western Front were killed or wounded while in the trenches. In 1918, the outbreak of influenza killed about 13 million people. Civilians died from exposure, starvation, military encounters, and massacres. Bomb victims such as merchant seamen and passengers on ships were recorded. Civilians killed by disease or war deprivation aren't included, but there is an estimated 70 million people who died from the influenza pandemic. Influenza spread quickly and killed many due to the large amounts of men living in extremely small military barracks and trenches. The trenches were full of rats and diseases, causing many to get sick. Considering how parties were thrown to celebrate when the war was declared, the world never expected the war to be this serious.
As a whole, it is extremely difficult to pinpoint one singular cause of World War I. A strong nationalist spirit backed up the Axis and Allied powers and propelled them into war. Throughout the war, many advances in weaponry were made to further aid nations. When the war was over, the catastrophic ruins of countries and grieving families remained. As the world observed what had happened, they wondered if anything this bad could or would happen ever again.